Thank you very much. It's great to see so many of you here, despite the temptations of getting out in the sunshine on a beautiful day. And thank you very much, Christine, for having set this up and for that introduction. So I'm talking about an article that I wrote a very long time ago. Famine, Affluence and Morality was originally published in 1972, and it's now been republished together with a couple of more recent essays and a previously unpublished preface and a foreword by Bill and Melinda Gates as this little book, Famine, Affluence and Morality. And I'm delighted that OUP have had the idea that this essay is still relevant today and that it's something that is worth getting out there and reminding people about. But let me just take you back a little bit to the circumstances in which it was written, which most of you will not be able to remember. I can see looking around the room. For those who don't know, there was a time when the country that is now Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan. It was called East Pakistan. There was a movement for independence from what was then West Pakistan and is now just Pakistan. And that movement for independence was very brutally repressed by the Pakistani army. As a result of that repression, 9 million people fled across the border from East Pakistan to India. And this is just a small, tiny segment of that mass of humanity that was trying to escape the repression and widespread starvation that also had occurred because of the disruption of infrastructure because of that repression. I was living in Oxford at the time. I was a graduate student at the University of Oxford, and I was troubled by the fact that despite this vast number of people in great need, affluent nations were not doing very much to help. It wasn't that they didn't know about the situation, it was well publicized. The Beatle, George Harrison, or ex-Beatle I guess by then perhaps, put on a concert for Bangladesh and tried to raise money for it and did raise some money for it, and Oxfam and other organizations were fundraising for it. But they raised, I think, something like 20 or 30 million pounds, and the World Health Organization was saying that something like £500 million was needed to feed and provide sanitation and shelter for this very large number of refugees. And India was a much poorer country then than it is today, so it was not really going to be able to cope with this burden. So I wanted to write something about this. This was at a time when philosophy was, at least English-speaking philosophy, was just starting to return to what I see as its roots and true nature, going right back to Athens and ancient Athens and Socrates, of suggesting how we ought to live. It was emerging from a period when it was really analysing the meanings of moral terms in what was sometimes called ordinary language philosophy, and I think of as a phase that wasn't completely worthless, but it was less interesting than actually trying to grapple with these questions of how we ought to live that traditionally philosophy has been about. So I wanted to write something about this, and this seemed a good example, to ask what are our obligations as people living in an affluent society, pretty comfortable, pretty secure in terms of helping in a situation like this. But I didn't want to limit it either just to this particular crisis, which obviously at some point was going to be solved one way or the other, but generalizing to what we ought to do to help people in extreme poverty, which existed all over the world and which was also taking lives. So the argument that I put forward was really a very simple one, and I'll just run you quickly through the premises and the argument. So the first premise, I think, is very difficult to deny, that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter and medical care is a bad thing, and that was what these 9 million people were being threatened with at the time. So there was a bad thing happening. Second premise, somewhat more controversial, and I'll come back to this and say a little bit in defense of it, but I wanted to claim that if it's in our power to prevent something bad happening without sacrificing something of comparable moral significance, then we ought to do that. You're probably saying, well, what's of comparable moral significance? But I wanted to leave that as a kind of open expression for people to put their own values in. I didn't want to make my judgment in this article anyway as to what might be of comparable moral significance to suffering and death from lack of food and so on. I wanted people to ask themselves, so here's, I could do something. We're getting obviously the question of, I could donate to Oxfam's appeal. I could do something. What would I be sacrificing if I were to make a substantial donation to that appeal? Would it be of comparable moral significance to the death and suffering that it would prevent? And I thought that most people living in affluent countries, if they were honest with themselves, would say, well, I could give quite a lot before I reached the point where I was sacrificing anything that, even in terms of my own values, whatever they might be, would be of comparable moral significance to what we would be preventing. So that's the second premise. And the third is a factual claim that it is in our power to prevent the suffering and death without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. So that's obviously a claim that needs to be defended as well in terms of what the factual situation in the world is, and I'll come back to that. But from those three premises, we can draw the conclusion that we ought to do what would prevent the suffering and death from lack of food, where we can, and if indeed it's the case that when that's in our power, we ought to do it. So that's the really simple argument, and I think one of the reasons why the article has been very successful and is still widely known and discussed and reprinted in many anthologies and textbooks is because that argument is so simple. It doesn't require great philosophical sophistication to spell out what the argument is. Now, some people see that as a disadvantage, particularly if I go and lecture on this sort of topic in a place like France. They all think, oh, this can't really be philosophy. I can understand it. It's not profound enough. But I think we can get into deeper questions if we want to, and we don't need to make the language more complicated. Okay, let's though look at the defense of the premises, and we'll start with the second premise. So in defending the second premise, I told a little story, and the story might be the other reason that the article has been so widely read, called The Drowning Child in the Shallow Pond. I couldn't find, despite everything that's on the internet, you'd think everything is there, I could not find a photo of a child drowning in a pond. But I found a photo of a rather happy toddler playing in water, and that's going to have to do. The story is laid out here. You're walking across a park, and there's a shallow pond in the park. You know that the pond is shallow. You've been walking through the park on summer days when kids have been playing, and you know that if there's a teenager in the water, it's only up to his waist, say. But today it's not summer, there's nobody else around. You wouldn't expect anyone to be in the water at all, but you do see something in the water, and when you look more closely, you see it's a very small child, a toddler, and although the pond is shallow, it's too deep for this child, and this child is apparently drowning, in danger of drowning. Your first response probably would be to look around and say, who's looking after this child? Where's the father or mother or babysitter? Somebody has to be taking care of this child, but you can't see anyone. You don't know how it could happen that this small child could be alone and fallen in the pond, but that apparently is what's happened, and there's nobody else there. So it looks like the only way to stop this child drowning is for you to run into the pond and quickly grab the child and pull the child out. Not a dangerous thing to do, but you realize there is some cost to you involved. As bad luck would have it, you've dressed in your most expensive outfit because you're going to meet someone you want to impress, and it's going to get ruined. Your expensive shoes, your suit, whatever else it might be, is going to get ruined by wading into this muddy pond. It's going to be inconvenient for you. You're going to have to go back and dry off, call your friend and say you're going to be late, whatever, and you're up for the expense of replacing your nice clothing that you bought recently. Nevertheless, most people would think, if you said, yeah, well, I don't want to damage my shoes, and after all, this is not my child, and I'm not responsible for this child. Nobody said, you know, please look after this child or anything like that. So why don't I just forget about it and go on my way? If you said that, most people, I think, would think that you'd done something really bad, something really wrong. I thought of this as a purely hypothetical example, but there are cases of people who neglect to take simple steps that will save a child's life. There was one that got a lot of attention in China 3 years ago because it was caught on video. This is a street in the city of Foshan, and there is a child here who has been previously hit by a van driving down the street. The child's mother is not aware that this has happened to her child. She's doing something else. And the video camera captures a number of people walking down the street like this man, basically looking away from the child. It's pretty hard to imagine that this person who's walked from down there has not noticed that there's a child lying in the street, but he's paying no attention to the child. And over a period, I can't remember exactly how long, but over a period of 10 minutes or so, something like a dozen people walked down the street without paying any attention, and tragically a second car hit and ran over the child while she was lying on the street. After that, a woman who's cleaning the street did notice the child and sounded the alarm. The child was taken to hospital, but the injuries were too severe and the child died. That was then shown in China on national news programs, and there was a huge outcry that, you know, this was a terrible thing, that what's happening to China, why don't we care about each other? And it was very widespread condemnation, as you'd expect, of the people who had done nothing to help the child. So it's not just a sort of local thing. I think if we think, yes, you ought to have helped the child in the pond, and people in China also think you ought to help someone in the street, it may not always happen, but the moral judgment that I'm looking for, that I'm inviting you to make, is one ought not to do this. I hope you would be thinking that you yourself, if you're in this situation, would not do this, that you would help the child. You would think that the cost of replacing your clothes would not be anything of comparable moral significance to saving the child's life, and therefore that's something you ought to do. So if I do have your agreement on that, your support on that, then I can use that as a way of saying, at least in that particular case, the child in the pond sort of case, or the child in the street here, you agree that if it's in your power to prevent something really bad happening without sacrificing something comparably significant, you ought to do it. And that is an important step in the argument. It shows that you're not taking the view that you only have obligations if you have in some way some special responsibility. Let's say you promise to look after the child, or the child is your child, or something like that. If you think that this would be wrong, you're actually saying we do have obligations to help strangers, even when we haven't voluntarily taken on those kinds of obligations. And that's the judgment that or part of the judgment that lies behind the second premise that I want to get you to agree to. But of course you might say, well, I agree in the case of the child in the pond, or the child in the street there, but the analogy, if you're going to use, as I presume you've probably already seen the strategy here, if you're going to use this as an analogy for saying I ought to help strangers in Bangladesh, or refugees from Bangladesh or in India, or for that matter right now that you ought to help people in developing countries who are in need, who you can help, then that analogy, there's too many differences between the two situations. And so I want to say a little bit about that now. So the question is, yes, there are obviously differences between the situations, many differences. Are they morally relevant differences between those situations? And there's such a lot of differences that I'm not going to be able to mention them all, but I am going to mention some that I think are psychologically relevant in that they would affect perhaps the likelihood that people will help, differences between the child in the pond and the global poverty situation today, and maybe they affect the moral judgments that people will make about whether we ought to help or not. So I'll just go fairly quickly through these because I know we have a limited amount of time. So in the child in the pond, there's an identifiable child. You don't know this child's name or much about this child, but you can see it's that child I'll be helping. It's one particular individual. In global poverty, you don't know who you'll be helping. You may donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, a highly effective charity that distributes bed nets in areas where malaria kills children, and it's been very well documented by the best possible methods, by randomized controlled trials, that distributing bed nets does reduce child mortality at modest cost. But of course, if you contribute to the Against Malaria Foundation, you're never going to know which child's life you saved, because it's a counterfactual. It's, well, if this child hadn't been sleeping under a bed net, he or she would have got malaria and would have died. And that, if you distribute enough bed nets, there will be such a child that fills that description, but you'll never know which one it is. And psychologically, we're much readier to help an identifiable individual than a statistical individual. The futility aspect is another little sort of psychological trick that we play on ourselves. When we think of the child in the pond, we think, I can save that child, and when I've saved that child, I've solved the problem. There's nobody else needing to be saved around there. But when we think about global poverty, we often think, but there are, the current World Bank figure is 700 million people living in extreme poverty. There's no way I can help all of them. In fact, the difference that I could make is insignificant compared to the size of the problem. It's a drop in the ocean, we sometimes say. And that is a discouraging factor that makes us less likely to do it. But if you think of it from the point of view of the individual you've helped, it's just as much a benefit for that individual that you've saved their life or saved the life of their child or prevented them going blind or reduced their suffering from a disease. It doesn't reduce the value of that benefit that, sadly, there are hundreds of millions of other people who are still in that situation. I think it's still just as important a benefit. The diffusion of responsibility, also in the child in the pond, I said you're the only person who can help, but clearly that's not the case with global poverty. There are, again, hundreds of millions of people who can help, some of whom are wealthier than you, and some of those people who are wealthier than you are helping, like Bill and Melinda Gates, for example. Others who are a lot wealthier than you are not helping at all. So you might say, well, why me? Why am I the one who should do something about this? And again, psychologically, there are all sorts of experiments psychologists have done that show that we are less likely to help others if we're one of a group and we see that others in the group are not helping. It's something that, in a sense, deters us from helping. But mostly we think that that's wrong, at least in retrospect when we're outside it. I mean, we think that people should have helped, and the fact that they were part of a society where people didn't help very much doesn't really excuse them. If we think about people who turned a blind eye to what was happening in Nazi Germany, we don't think the fact that they were just one of many is a sufficient excuse. And I think here too, we should think that, well, I can still make some difference. Even if other people won't, I can make some difference. And maybe if I and a few others start helping, that will make it easier for others to join in. We'll build up the critical mass of people helping, and we'll actually counteract this psychological effect of diffusion of responsibility. The child in the pond is near, and the refugees in India were far away, and other people in extreme poverty are far away from where we are now. Most people, when they think about that, are pretty clear about that doesn't really make a difference to my obligations. If the distance makes it harder for me to actually do anything, then sure, that makes a difference. But that's relevant to the other premise that I showed you, the one about whether it's in our power to do something. If it's just distance, I think we can see pretty clearly that it's not that critical. You can see the child for yourself and sum up the situation. You don't have to rely on information from others. Psychologically, that makes a difference too. But again, I would say what really matters is the quality of information. Are you getting good information? Is it reliable information? Could somebody be trying to scam you into sending them a donation or sending a donation to an organisation that isn't a bona fide organisation at all? All of those are very relevant and proper concerns. But otherwise, whether you actually see it with your own eyes or whether you get information from a source that you believe is fully reliable, I don't think should make a difference. So, although psychologically these are disanalogies, I want to argue that morally they're not really relevant. And this is my explanation of what's going on, which owes something to the Harvard psychologist Joshua Green, who has a book called Moral Tribes, which is about moral psychology and its implications in this kind of area that I highly recommend. So why do we have these responses that I just described? We have them because we evolved in small face-to-face societies where basically we knew the people we could help. They were identifiable individuals and they were part of our group. And to that extent, some of these responses are hardwired into us. They're part of our biology. But the world has changed in the last century or two very dramatically. It's changed in the sense that we live now in a much bigger community and we have the ability to know what's going on far away from us, which we never had before, and we have the ability to actually help and make a difference. Not quite as instantly as we have the ability to know what's happening, but quickly enough. Of course, the evolution doesn't work that fast. The biology hasn't changed. We still have the innate responses that are more suited to the many millennia in which we've lived, or millions of years going back to our pre-human ancestors even, in which we've lived in small social groups. So that's why we have these notions, but now we really need to go beyond them. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't have emotions in this area, but we need to use our reason and our ability to reflect in order to go beyond them and think about what we ought to do in a different way. So the psychological differences, I'm saying, are not always morally relevant, and I just said what's the second part of that slide, so I needn't repeat that. Briefly, I want to make sure that you have time for questions, so I don't want to go on too long. I'll just briefly run through the factual claim I made that it's in our power to do something. Has been challenged. Some of you may have read some critiques of aid. Bill Easterly's book, The White Man's Burden, Dambisa Moyo's Dead Aid, and my Princeton colleague Angus Deaton, who this year got the Nobel Prize for Economics, also has some criticisms of aid in his excellent book, The Great Escape. But I think the more sweeping critiques that come from Easterly and Moyo are not applicable to what I'm talking about. They're directed at government aid, multilateral aid, not at the NGOs that I would recommend you give your aid to. Very few of us say we want to give aid to the government, so give money to the government so it can increase its aid. Even as far as government's concerned, I think Easterly and Moyo are a little unfair, especially where you have governments that have been reasonably thoughtful, as DFID has in this country, in terms of overcoming some of the objections that certainly have existed in the past to aid. And as far as Deaton's critique, which is a more nuanced one, Deaton acknowledges that aid, particularly in the health area, has saved millions of lives. And I think there's no doubt about that. You look at the figures, child deaths have come down very dramatically in the last 50 years or more, from 20 million in 1960 to under 6 million today. So we're less than a third of the number of children who die before their 5th birthday, as compared to 50 years ago, despite the fact that the world's population has more than doubled. So effectively, the death rate for children under 5 is less than 1/6 of what it was. That's very good news. Aid can't claim all the credit for that. Obviously, economic development in countries like China in particular has made a huge difference here. But I think it's clear that aid has also made a difference, and there's data on that which I could go into, but I think that the data is pretty clear in some cases that aid programs have made an important difference in reducing child mortality, also in doing other things like reducing incidence of preventable blindness from trachoma, and dealing with a whole range of other conditions that cause a lot of suffering, providing more education, particularly education for girls, providing information about family planning, a whole lot of different things that aid has done. So I think the factual premise is justified. We do have it in our power to do things as long as we choose carefully and thoughtfully about what we're doing with our resources. So the only thing that I do want to correct here, having said that, is in the original article I said, like, for the cost of your ruined pair of shoes you could save a life. Well, you're going to have to really be very much at the top end of the shoe market for that to be true on the more recent research, because whereas I thought earlier maybe there was some suggestions that for a couple of $100 you could save a child's life, more recent research suggests that it's significantly more than that. It might be in the 1,000 or 2 range, but it's still, I think, not something that's, most of us would not have to give up something comparably significant in order to achieve that. Okay, aren't I giving through my taxes? Yes, if you pay taxes in the UK, you are giving to one of the countries that now, thanks to a bipartisan pledge that's actually been fulfilled, is among the better nations in the world, and that's really good. Much better than where I spend part of each year, Australia, and better still than where I spend the other part of each year. The US is really pretty miserable on this scale, but still, this line is 0.7% of gross national income. It's not very much. 70 pence in every £100 the nation earns is not very much. I think we could do a lot better than that. So this is a sort of the big question about the whole thing is, well, how much should we give? What is this level of comparable moral significance? Doesn't it make life very demanding to go all the way there? And when the article, the Famine, Affluence and Morality article first came out, it was used, as I said, in a lot of classrooms. Professors gave it to their students to read because they could read it and they could be challenged by it. But I've heard from a number of people that the way in which it was used was basically, look, here's a rather plausible argument. The premises seem like they're plausible. Certainly the conclusion follows if you accept the premise. But the conclusion is so demanding, it must be wrong, right? So your job is to show where the argument goes wrong. And that was something that seemed to work quite well as a teaching tool. But one of the interesting things that's happened more recently, and perhaps one of the reasons why OUP thought would be good to have the article out there again, is that in fact some more people now are seeing this not as an objection but as a reason for doing something about it. And that relates to what's now known as effective altruism, a new movement, certainly within the last 10 years, that is trying to publicize the idea of living as if that argument actually mattered and as if we could do something about it. So here's one of the founders of this movement. It's sort of not a single organization that's got it going. There are a number of different people, different organizations. One of them is Toby Ord, who is now a research fellow in philosophy at Oxford. He read the article as a student. He decided that he wanted to live so as to make the world a better place. So he thought, well, I'm doing okay as a student. I'm on this graduate studentship. I think it was around £16,000 or maybe £14,000. He said, yeah, I could maybe have a little bit more, but I'm not really missing anything. And I'm heading for an academic career after I get my my DPhil. I'm probably going to get an academic job. I'll be earning a lot more than my studentship. Suppose that I just continue to live on this studentship or inflation-adjusted amount of this studentship, or a little bit more. So he's pledged to live on that amount adjusted for inflation. It's probably a bit higher than that by now because he made that pledge a few years ago. And to give away the rest. And he worked out what he might do with that. He picked as a highly effective thing to do preventing blindness from trachoma, the largest cause of preventable blindness in the world that affects people in developing countries. Pretty cheap to prevent. Because he likes doing maths and sums and so on, he decided to work out how much he would be able to give away if he had a normal academic trajectory at the kind of salaries that academics are likely to have until retirement, and continued to live on this amount. And so he got this large sum of money, notional large sum of money, divided it by the cost of preventing blindness from trachoma, and ended up with a figure of 80,000. 80,000 cases of blindness that he alone, not a very rich person, no Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, he alone would be able to prevent. And he thought that was very impressive. He was sort of thrilled to think that he could do that much good in the world, and decided to tell people about it. So he founded this organization, Giving What We Can, encouraged people not to take a pledge as tough as the one he did, but to pledge to give 10% of their income to effective charities. Here's somebody who came to this completely independent, Julia Weis, a woman living in Boston, who sort of thought that, learning how much better she is than other people, wanted to give quite a lot to help people and could live on less, persuaded her then boyfriend, now husband, to join her in doing this. And incidentally, Jeff Kaufman works for Google in Boston. But even before he got this job at Google, they were already donating a substantial amount of their income. They were, I think, donating something like 30% of it, even when their total income was no more than around $50,000 a year. Now that Jeff has a nice Google job, they've upped this to 50% of their income. And if you want to read about how Julia feels about it, she writes this engaging kind of personal blog at givinggladly.com, and you can see what she does and how she lives and why she thinks this is important by looking at that. And this is probably the most impressive sort of case of the influence of philosophy on direct behavior. This is not somebody that I've ever met, but I got an email out of the blue a few years ago telling me that as a result of discussing famine, affluence and morality in class, the sort of discussion went, well, there's this argument and leads to saying you should give away a lot of money, and then somebody else they read said, well, if that argument were true, it wouldn't just apply to giving money. You could help people, for example, by donating a kidney to a stranger. And again, this was seen as a reductio ad absurdum, that morality couldn't be that demanding, that's what we ought to do. But Chris, after thinking about it and discussing it with other people, he didn't rush into this, took some months to reach this decision, decided that was what he wanted to do. And you see him here just after doing that. I've continued to be in touch with him, and he's very happy about what he's done. He's in good health. He's been in contact with the person who received the kidney, who was a man in his 40s, who was a school teacher teaching in an underprivileged school in St. Louis, so he feels really good about that. Of course, you never know who you're going to give to. It could have been someone who was a conservative Republican or whatever. Chris might have felt less happy, but it's turned out well for him anyway. I'm not. There are a few people who do this. I think it's probably for most people, including me. It may be a step too far, but it's an example of the way that philosophy can make a difference. Okay, I'm nearly done. So this is this movement, effective altruism. You can look it up on Wikipedia now. So it's pretty new. It wasn't there a few years ago. Stresses the idea about applying evidence and reason. And here's one way of doing this, an organization, this is American rather than UK, but an organization called GiveWell that reviews charities, finds ones for which there's really clear evidence and recommends them. So just this thin slice. That doesn't mean that all these other charities that have been reviewed are actually not effective, what it means is they have not been able to produce good enough evidence to satisfy the rigorous assessment that GiveWell does that they are effective. And that's a very different question. But GiveWell is kind of driving the movement to get more data, to get independent studies, to get good analysis so that we can know which are the really effective charities. And that's certainly helped the whole effective altruism movement. Here again is the one that Toby Ord started, and they also have, if you go to the Where to Give tab, they also recommend charities more suited for, perhaps for the UK if you're interested in tax deductibility for donations in the UK. And there's one that I've involved with that has the title of an earlier book of mine, The Life You Can Save. Somewhat more global in the charities that it recommends, slightly less rigorous in the evidence required than GiveWell, because we wanted a broader group of organisations. But if you're interested, have a look at any of those websites. And at that, I'm going to stop so that we still have some time for questions. Thanks very much.
Right, so we have two microphones. We've got Jan with a microphone over there. I've got one. I'm going to start with a question, if I may. I love the link between this book and the ideas around effective altruism. I wonder, though, about what your thoughts on the immediacy of social media and the immediacy of what we're able to do now in order to bring us closer to things happening on the other side of the globe. Does that change our behavior, or do we suffer from information overload?
I'm hoping that we'll change our behaviour. It probably already is changing our behaviour, but I haven't seen good enough data on that. Obviously, all of these things have positives and negatives. I would like sort of the positive that we feel more closely connected to people on the other side of the world. So I like the idea of, Mark Zuckerberg's internet.org, that everybody in the world eventually is going to be on the net and we can communicate with them in some way. I think it'll be excellent if that spreads. Sometimes the social media get people to focus on a particular thing that goes viral, and it may not be the most effective thing. We had the ice bucket challenge a year or so ago. That was fine, but it was dealing with a fairly rare disease in affluent countries. If we want to use our resources most effectively to help people suffering from diseases, there are others affecting people in developing countries where it would be much more cost effective to donate.
So there's two elements of this. Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
One of them is getting people to donate more, and the other one is donate to effective charities. For example, Against Malaria Foundation, from what I know, is about 100 times more effective than the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge per dollar. Which of those areas do you find it is easier to convince people to make an improvement? And what sort of strategies have you learned from writing your books and so on, and how you managed to convince those people to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really have good data to say which of them have I found more successful. I do know people who've started giving because of arguments that I and others in the effective altruism movement have put forward. I know quite a lot of people who've taken that up and perhaps in some way responded to that argument, maybe thought they should do something before, but didn't get around to doing it. So that's certainly possible. Probably, though, you typically get more resistance when you tell people they ought to be giving or they ought to be giving more than if you tell them they ought to be giving more effectively, at least the kind of audiences that I talk about. But I do get pushback from that as well. I get pushback from some people say, but look, you're taking the emotional component out of giving, you're telling people to think about it, and if people don't feel emotionally, then they're not going to give at all. I don't accept that I'm taking the emotional component out of it. I'm trying to change the emotional component in some way. And I also get pushback, I should say, from people in the philanthropy sector as such, so professional philanthropy advisors, those who are involved in organizations for promoting philanthropy. They want to be cause neutral because they don't want to turn people away. If they're philanthropy advisors and potential clients come to them and say, we'd like your advice on how to give we want to give away some of our money or leave our estate to something, and then they say to you, and we're really passionate about music, so we want to endow a new opera hall for our city. And if you then say to them, well, I don't really think a new opera hall is what the world most needs, you should be helping to prevent blindness in Africa, then they're worried that those people will just go away and find somebody else to talk to. So they kind of have this official idea that we can't judge. We can't judge between different causes. I think that's wrong, but I can sort of understand from their point of view why they're saying that. We had someone in the back there, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually a really similar question, but with the example of International Rescue Committee, who were really praised because they did this large-scale monitoring and evaluation process, and it turned out that their most expensive, longest-running program had no impact. And there was debate, should you publish that or not, because it will be so psychologically discouraging. Is it a moral thing to publish that finding or not? You just answered it, but yeah, thank you.
No, I think it's great that people do those trials and that they are prepared to publish them. Best of all is if they commit themselves in advance of the trial by announcing that they're doing a trial. And that's what some organisations are doing. One of a very transparent organisation is Give Directly. Give Directly has pioneered handing out one-off cash grants to poor families in East Africa. It sort of finds poor families, gives them $1,000, makes it clear that that's what they're going to get. They're not going to get, it's not a permanent thing, and then sees what they do with it and whether they come out better. And they announced beforehand that they were going to do a randomised trial, so they were committed to publicising the results of the trial, however they came out. They did come out well. They're now actually trying a guaranteed minimum income scheme to see whether, if they do give regular minimum amounts, what that does to people. And again, they've announced that they will do a trial on that without knowing how it's going to come out.
So you explain your moral argument with the sound logic that applies to NGOs, but there are many ways in which entities try to target helping the developing world, sometimes even extreme, such as military interventions. So my question is, how do you think, to what extent do you think your moral framework applies to such ways of helping out rather than just directly through NGOs?
I think the overriding framework applies. I'm focusing on NGOs because I'm addressing people who might have decisions about what to do with surplus income, or sometimes with time that they might be prepared to volunteer, or whatever it is. Nobody, none of you will have the power to say, oh, we ought to be intervening in Syria, so let's do that. I mean, you might decide to write a letter to a paper, or you might decide to vote for someone who thinks you ought to do that, but very marginal effect that you can have there. But I do think if you're considering something like intervention, you ought to be weighing up the costs and benefits of what that ought to be. And that's why, some cases I think we've missed opportunities to get huge benefits at rather small costs. Rwanda would be the classic case of that, where according to the Canadian leader of the UN forces that were there before, another 5,000 well-trained troops could have stopped the massacre that took 800,000 lives. I think it's very regrettable that didn't happen. But other people have called for intervention. For example, at the time of the Kosovo intervention against Serbia, other people said, well, what about what Russia is doing in Chechnya? Isn't that just as bad as what the Serbs are doing in Kosovo? And the answer might well be, yes, it was just as bad, but who wants a war with a major nuclear armed power, right? The costs are going to be absurd. So I do think the ultimate framework is applicable to those situations.
With your argument, how should we compare individuals to corporations? So if a company such as Google, what level should we be giving percentage of our profits back to charities?
What level should Google give?
Corporations in general.
Yeah. Corporations are in somewhat different situations in that they have fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. Of course, they can give and they can justify this in terms of being good for the image of the country. So there's of the company. So there is a fair amount of flexibility, and I think Google would enhance its reputation by giving quite a lot. I know that it does have Google.org, and it's funding a lot of projects through that. and some of those I hope will do a lot of good. So it's hard for me to put any kind of specific figure on that. But that's an important thing. And then also in terms of what the company is doing, the sort of corporate social responsibility policies, I think are also important. And there's quite a lot of thought going into that has also had beneficial consequences on a number of different companies. So that's not a very specific answer, I'm sorry. If you have suggestions about what kind of level ought to be set, I'm interested in listening to them, but I don't feel I have the knowledge to be more specific.
Great, we've got time for 2 more questions.
I like your initial 3-step argument. I wonder, where do you stop? So in the example of a child that is drowning, if somebody told me you can have a meal or you can skip lunch today and you'll save a child, I'll probably skip lunch today and save a child. So if I give all my spare money to charity today, I could still probably miss a meal one day and save a child. So I should do that. And then I could probably get another job and donate that money to charity and save even another life, because that's what I would do for a child. If somebody told me you have to work an extra 2 hours today to save a child here, and the same goes as why only focus on donating money? Why, I walk home and there's a homeless person, and that person would probably be hungry and cold tonight. I could take him home. So why shouldn't I do that? It's a bit of a tricky question, but I think I understand your moral framework and I like it. I just wonder, as such a simple moral framework, if you would do anything to save a child that is drowning right here, then where do you stop? Like where do you put the boundary between how much are you willing to give? Because with such a simple analogy, what occurs to me is that I should stop, or everybody should stop doing everything and give 100% or more than 100%, like make a massive effort to donate everything.
Well, you probably shouldn't stop working because that's the source of your income, and you actually should be trying to work to if you're fortunate enough to have a well-paying job, you should be using that income and perhaps maximizing that income. Some people in the effective altruism movement have deliberately chosen higher income careers. I had a student at Princeton who could have gone on to graduate school and probably had a career as a philosophy professor, but because he had a strong maths background, he also had very good offers from Wall Street to go and work there, and decided to do that, and has been doing that for the past 4 or 5 years, donating half of his income, which even in the first year enabled him to donate $100,000 to effective charities. So he sees that as a path of doing good. Some people would say, well, no, if that wasn't the kind of work that I really want to do, I just couldn't face doing that. But they'll earn less, but they'll still give significantly. But you're asking, I suppose, where do you draw this line? And I don't have a very good answer to that. In the original essay, I said, ultimately, the only line you can draw is the point at which, well, I said 2 things. One is, if there are certain things that you need in order to maintain your income, so it doesn't apply to Google, obviously, but some jobs you need to be able to dress in a suit and wear a tie and so on. So you can't give away so much that you can't afford, you can no longer hold the job and do well in your job. That's one thing. But apart from that, I said, really the ultimate line would just be where you've impoverished yourself so much that if you gave away more, you would be adding to your own difficulties, suffering, whatever you want to call it, as much as you would be alleviating the difficulties or suffering of someone else. That's the ultimate line. But I was a lot younger when I wrote that, and maybe I've become a little more realistic in terms of what you can say to people and what you can expect them to do. And I think that even if in some sense that still is ultimately what you ought to do, there's a difference between that and what we ought to expect people to do, what we ought to blame people for not doing. And I think that if people sort of just start doing something, make a substantial difference, and then say, I'm going to try this out, if I'm comfortable with it, I'm going to increase it year after year, I'll be doing more. I think that's the kind of appeal that has more hope of attracting a large number of people. So that's at least the public answer that I give to your question. Thanks. And there was the last one.
Yeah,
here.
so quick question. In your slide when you were talking about the psychological reasons against it and things, so you didn't touch at all, I think, on sort of reciprocation, which seems to me quite a big, the idea that, if you see a child drowning, you can think, well, if my child was drowning, I'd want one of my neighbours to help me. But when you're seeing a disaster, famines across the other side of the world, people probably don't feel like one day that could be me in the famine, if you're in sort of developed world. I think that can take some of the sort of at least the urgency out of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's not, when you said reciprocation, I thought you meant, that this person is actually likely to help me in some way. That's one sense of reciprocation, but that doesn't apply to the child in the pond either. So what you're talking about is rather the kind of imagine yourself in that position, that could happen to you, or your child could be drowning and you'd want somebody to do that. And then the question would be, well, how far can we carry out that exercise, right? Okay, so I do have a child, let's say, that age. I mean, I don't anymore. My children are grown up, but I guess I have a grandchild of that age, so I would say that. I would want somebody to rescue my grandchild. Could I say, well, I could become a refugee or something like that? I think I could imagine that. In fact, my parents were refugees from the Nazis. They came to Australia when the Nazis took over Austria. So it's not, I don't have to go that far back to think that, well, I certainly am very glad that people helped them and that Australians took them. And so it depends on how far you're going to carry that. But I think we can put ourselves in the position of others in some ways. We can form connections. And the original question that Christina asked about social media, I guess, may make it easier for us to see how we could be in that situation in some perhaps not really likely circumstances, but imaginable circumstances.
I don't think that the reciprocation thing I don't think it's a good argument, but I think that sort of intuitively it feels that that's something that would inherently stop people taking that step. Okay,
right. So then it's also related to they're people like me, they're part of my group.
Yeah, it's sort of an in-group, out-group thing.
Yeah, really, you're right. And it is something that I could have added to that list, but didn't. Yeah, thanks.
I'm terribly sorry, but we're out of time. This has been an incredible, thought-provoking talk with a wonderful call to action. I hope we all stop and think about what we ought to do, how we ought to live. Please join me in thanking Professor Peter Singer.